Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was The Shins with The Past and Pending. And on this week's show, I am going to be discussing an issue that's related to the past, and it's related to the past of birds. And this is a topic that I became interested in last week, actually, when I was doing some research for a lecture that I'm going to be giving this week in a class at the University of Exeter that's all about birds and bird biology. So if you're a listener to the show on a regular basis, then you know that I love birds and I'm interested in bird behavior, and in particular I'm interested in bird communication. And I've discussed bird communication in the past on the show, but this particular study that I ran across last week is actually a relatively new one. So it's one that was published just this spring of this year, so it's pretty new research, and I kind of vaguely recall seeing the headlines when this came out, but obviously I was a bit busy, I wasn't paying too much attention, because actually it is quite a groundbreaking result that these guys have come up with, and I didn't really even quite get it until this time, just this last week when I was reading the paper and found out exactly what these guys have discovered. And it's quite a nice thing to talk about on today's show, I think, because it brings together lots of different topics that I have addressed in some way or another over the last couple of years that I've been doing the show. So we've got a little bit of information about evolution, thinking about birds and bird singing, and thinking about sexual selection and kind of why males and females might have some differences and, as it turns out, some similarities, and the pressures of the environment and also of other birds. So it kind of brings together a whole lot of things that I've discussed in some form. And this particular study is one that looks at what was the ancestral state of song production in birds, and is it the same trait that we see today? So are birds very much like their ancestors, or do we see different individuals now that are singing than those that might have been singing in the past? So that's kind of the very broad topic. Now let me give you a bit of an introduction and then tell you a little bit more about the specific research questions that were discussed in this study. Now, as I've discussed before, some individuals within a species can evolve very elaborate traits, and in males, these are usually attributed to sexual selection. Now, the kind of traits I'm talking about are things like the gigantic tail of a peacock, or the really complex and intricate song of a male bird that sings in the springtime and in the summer during the breeding season, or other really elaborate vocal signals, visual signals, chemical signals. It all depends on what species you're talking about. And this is true not just in birds, but across the animal kingdom, and actually in other types of organisms as well. So this isn't just limited to animals, it can also include plants, fungi, all sorts of things. We know we can have sex differences in the way that these things look or behave, and those really elaborate differentiations can be related to sexual selection. And that is selection that is associated with the fact that certain individuals are more successful during the breeding season than others. And that might be because they are able to better attract mates, or better to scare off rivals, or have some sort of better sex result once they've actually had mating, so maybe their sperm are bigger and better. Whatever the case might be, it indicates that there is some sort of selective pressure that is related to the whole situation surrounding sex from start to finish. Now in females, we can see some different patterns. So we often know that females are a bit more drab than males, or a bit more subtle, as one of my professors used to say, because she didn't like the connotation of drab. So we tend to think about females as having kind of different constraints around their evolution. So these guys often need to sit on nests and be subtle for that reason, so they aren't found when they're incubating. They often don't have to fight quite as much with rivals. It's the males that do the fighting, so they don't have to be as large or as strong or as kind of aggressive. So there are all sorts of reasons why they might be quite different. But there are some females as well in which you've got females looking like males, acting like males. They share the same traits. They might actually have the same sorts of behaviors. And whenever we're looking at these sorts of distinctions, or in fact similarities, there has been some argument in the past and some controversy in the scientific community over whether female traits are arising through sexual selection or through social and natural selection. So are females also sometimes going to elaborate their traits because they've got males that are choosing for them? So maybe you have really brightly colored females because the males can pay attention to that signal just like the females can pay attention to it in males. Or maybe there's some kind of a social or natural selection process going on where the females are evolving those traits for other reasons entirely, and it has nothing to do with the process that is occurring to shape those kind of characteristics in males. And this is difficult to study because basically we're lacking a lot of knowledge about female signal traits, and this is especially true in birdsong. People have been so obsessed for so long about the males and in any kind of communication system, in the signalers, that they kind of forget the other animals that maybe are doing important things as well. So the receivers, the ones that typically are kind of paying attention to these sorts of signals, just because they aren't quite as showy in the way they behave, sometimes they're ignored when in fact they might also be signalers. They just might not be doing it in such an obvious way. And certainly in birdsong, for example, it's been only very recently that people have really started paying attention to the role of the female in that communication process and thinking about whether females might have certain sorts of functions and behaviors just as males do, but we've just overlooked them in the past. And that's kind of the sort of question that's being asked in this current study. So let's think a little bit about birdsong in general. Now, songbirds are also called passerines, so these guys are generally thought to have evolved complex songs and large repertoires because males have been subject to sexual selection. So males that have these complex, really intricate songs are ones that can kind of advertise that they are smart, they're in good condition, they're big, they are well-learned, whatever the case might be. And it kind of varies from one species to another because birds pick up songs in different ways and they're affected by the environment and by other birds in different ways. But whatever the case might be, they're using those large repertoires to show that they are quite tough and experienced, old, big, and they therefore are in the position to fight off any potential intruders. And they can also use those same sorts of conditions to advertise the fact that they are quite an interesting mate, and so females should choose them to sire their offspring. And so typically, those are the two main things that have been focused on when we're thinking about how song evolves and who evolves song and how it's used in these different systems. Now, as you might know if you listened to the show in the past, males aren't the only ones that sing. So I've talked before about how sometimes in tropical habitats and in habitats where birds are breeding year-round or they are holding down territories year-round, we often have females that engage in song. Now, we do also have this in some temperate environments. So I've discussed in the past how I have listened to northern cardinals where the male and the female are calling back and forth to each other near the nest. And this is a bird that lives where I come from in Ohio and across much of the U.S. So it's not just in the tropics that we see this sort of thing, but it is much more common there. And as you know, here in the UK and also in the US where I come from, that's really not the norm. We tend to have species where you've got the male singing and then the male and female kind of calling, but calling is not really used in such a sexual context. So that standout elaborate trait is really only seen so much in males. So female song in general is dismissed as being rare or atypical, or maybe there are hormonal aberrations or some other kind of weird developmental problem that causes females to act in this unusual way that isn't actually the standard way of being for these animals. However, there have been some studies that have shown some contradictory results and have suggested that maybe there's something else that's actually responsible for this sort of behavior. And a review of the literature certainly suggests that there has been a geographical bias over time. So just like I said that the majority of the birds that we're familiar with here in the UK and also in the US, these are the ones that actually are in the literature the most. So if you look across all of the scientific studies that have been published, you tend to find that these are the locations where the most research has been done. There's a paucity of data from places like the tropics, places like Australia, China, and the whole of the Indonesian area there in kind of Southeast Asia, in India, in South America, and these are all places where we do actually find some really interesting song behavior in females. And so, of course, if you're kind of thinking about the way that the literature is published, there is this kind of bias that would automatically suggest that male-only songbirds are more common than the other types. And this suggests, again, that we need to perform we need to step back a minute and reanalyze things and do a quantitative assessment of female song across a diverse range of lineages. So thinking about birds from other continents, birds from other groups that have been studied, birds from other habitats, birds that have other types of life histories. So not just looking at the sorts of animals that we've already focused on, but expanding that and including lots more. And if we do that, then maybe we could see something much more interesting. So we would have geographic and evolutionary, phylogenetic kind of diversity that would point to potentially other patterns and to suggest that maybe it's not just sexual selection that's driving the signals in males, and it's not just the males that are doing really interesting communication behavior. So that's all the context for the current study. And this is a study that has led the authors to propose a completely different evolutionary scenario. So they suggested that perhaps once they did this big analysis over all the different regions, there might actually be a very different pattern, and they might find that female song is much more common than we think. So they wanted to kind of test the hypothesis that we do have females that are singing much more regularly than we think, and that in fact female song might be common among birds and maybe even the most common state, the dominant state, and in fact they even go so far as to say that maybe it's the ancestral state, so that all birds actually evolved with females singing, and then some lineages have just dropped that over time. So they felt that female birds, of course, they do acknowledge that female birds may have selected some of the most melodious or beautiful males according to their standard of beauty, to quote them. I thought that was quite a nice way of describing that, and they therefore have shaped male songs. So they haven't gotten rid of that altogether. But they do also suggest that female song might be more widespread and more ancestral in songbirds than we currently think. And they base this on the two main things that I mentioned before, which is that number one, the majority of the songbird diversity is found in tropical regions where females are frequently found to sing. So these are the very regions that we haven't yet really focused on very much. So they think that once we include those animals in the sample size, suddenly we'll see a very different pattern. And secondly, they suggest that there might be kind of a different pattern here because female song is widespread in Australasia, and this is the region where songbirds are thought to have originated. So phylogenetically, this is where these guys kind of evolved. So those are the two things that led them to say that maybe it's not just this whole shaping of male song, but also female song being important all along, and just having vanished from certain lineages that moved elsewhere and encountered different circumstances where the females didn't need to sing as much. So just to kind of give you a brief summary of the methods and results so you get a little bit more of an understanding of where I'm going to go as I describe these in more detail. They surveyed the occurrence of female song across all these different habitats around the world. They used a technique called ancestral state reconstruction to examine the likelihood that ancient birds had female singers. And they focused on songbirds because this is the major group of birds where you have learned sexually selected complex songs. But of course, there would be the potential to expand their analysis and include other species as well later on. They include all families of songbirds except those in the most recent radiation, because this is a group of birds that actually contributes very little to that kind of phylogenetic ancestral reconstruction, and so they're focusing on the most basal of species to get an idea of what would have happened in the ancestral birds. You don't need to know about the really current ones quite so much as the really ancient ones when you're trying to figure out what would those ancient ones have been like, the ones that are now extinct. So basically they were able to include, when you count in and count out all of those little things, 44 of the approximately 112 songbird families, and out of that they found that female song occurs in over 2/3 of all the surveyed songbird species and families. So obviously the majority of birds that they surveyed do have female song. So the ancestral state reconstruction that they were able to do using these data then revealed that females did sing in the ancestral songbird. And of course they don't know this for certain, it's all based on likelihoods, but pretty much every mathematical model they created did suggest that given the number of songbirds that sing today and where those guys are positioned, in the ancestral tree, in the phylogenetic tree, then it is likely that the ancient ancestor of songbirds had females that sang. And so this means that sexual dimorphism in song production may not actually arise as a result of sexual selection, that there's something else going on that makes females basically stop singing in some of these more recent lineages. Now that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of where I'm going to go with all this. Now I'm going to break for a song and then flesh out the methods and the results and the discussion in a bit more detail so that you understand exactly how they did their study and what those results mean. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Brandi Carlile with My Song. And on today's show, I am talking about a recent science study that looked at what the ancestral state might have been in the earliest songbirds. So looking specifically at whether females were likely to have been song producers as well as song receivers from the singing males. And the authors suspected that maybe, given the number of females that are known to sing today, actually this might have been an ancestral state, and we just haven't realized it all this time because we haven't really looked at all of the birds possible when collecting data in order to kind of create a data set looking at all the different species and all the different habitats around the world that perform these behaviors. So before the break, I kind of did a quick summary of what the authors did in the study, and now I want to actually go into each of those steps in a bit more detail so you understand how these data were collected and analyzed. So first up was the female song data set. So as I said before, what these guys wanted to do was expand our realm of knowledge from beyond kind of US and UK based bird species to include species from around the world, because the majority of our data set does involve species in temperate habitats that are here specifically in the United States and the United Kingdom, where you've got a majority of male singing species and species in which the females don't sing at all. And actually we know that in the tropics female song is much more common, and yet the tropics haven't really typically been studied in these sorts of analyses. So hopefully they wanted to be able to go to pre-existing data that just, they've been out there all along, but they just haven't been included in studies, and take advantage of these kind of natural history write-ups that authors have been doing all over these many years of bird study around the world. So they did this by going to what must be a massive volume called The Distribution and Taxonomy of the Birds of the World. And this is written by Sibley and Monroe. And you might not know the name of Monroe, but Sibley might be a bit more familiar to you, especially if you are a bird lover that has gone to the US. Because Sibley is quite well known. So there are two Sibleys. One is the elder Sibley, who is known for being an expert in bird genetics, and the other is the younger Sibley, who is known for drawing birds and producing lovely images of all the birds that are then used in the Sibley bird guides. So the Sibley family has made quite a large contribution to the world of ornithology, and in this particular case, the Sibley and Monroe's Distribution and Taxonomy of the Birds of the World, a very pithy little title, was used to gather data on female song for every Aucine passerin species that they could find in this book. So as I said, they excluded the one most recent kind of lineage of birds because they're so recent that they don't contribute very much to the ancestral state reconstruction, which is the analysis they use to kind of figure out the most likely characteristics of the ancestral state. So this most recent lineage is called Passerida or Passerida. You can pronounce these Latin words however you like, basically, and no one can really contradict you, so sorry if I'm doing it wrong. So these guys excluded that because there are actually hundreds and hundreds of species in that group, and they could spend tons of time collecting data on them, but then those data wouldn't actually contribute much to the total analysis. So they saved themselves some time because it has so little of an impact on the analysis. And the reason that it has such a little impact is that the divergences, the evolutionary divergences closest to the ancestral nodes, so the very earliest species that are being examined, those are the ones that have the greatest weight on the ancestral state, which makes a lot of sense because you think, if you just think about humans, you're likely to look like your mom or your dad, maybe a little bit less likely to look like your grandma or your grandfather. And if you keep going back and keep going back, you would kind of expect, a decreasingly similar condition to yourself because there is a dilution of the genes over all of that time. So actually, if you think about comparing how you are now to how your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was, that might not be the best way to figure out what that distant relative looked like. However, if you were to take that relative's offspring or maybe grandchild, you would expect a much greater similarity. And so that's basically what they're doing here. They're focusing on those species that are closest to the ancestor and not the ones that are here more current to our contemporary time. So just to give you an idea, just to really drive home the point, these passerine species that they excluded, that category contains over 3,800 species, but even if they had included all of that, it would have contributed less than 1% to that whole analysis and that whole reconstruction of the phylogeny. So really, it makes a lot of sense for them to save themselves some time. Now they also used another source of data on female song, and that's because the Sibley and Monroe is a bit earlier, so it was done in 1990, and since then there have of course been some changes, as you might expect, in how certain animals are classified. So there were some subspecies that were joined and some others that were split apart, and so they looked at this more recent paper in order to kind of bring the data set up to date. So that meant that they have this second source called Accelerated Speciation in Color Polymorphic Birds, which is another one that I'm sure you want to have right by the bed at night so you can read yourself to sleep if you have trouble going to bed. So ultimately, across these two different sources, they were able to include 1,141 different species in their original sample size. And I'll kind of explain here in a minute why it was that ends up shrinking by the time they actually do the analyses. So these are the two things that they were looking through, and they were able to comb through and find all the different species, and for each one of these they wanted to get an idea about female song. So all of the species that they were able to find, they scored on kind of a 4-point scale, basing this on their vocal behavior. So either the female song was present, so that means that the females were described in these sources as either having song or performing in duets, either synchronized, so they're singing with their mate, so it's just like what I was hearing in the northern cardinal, or antiphonal, which is where they go back and forth, and they're not necessarily coordinating with something else, so that they're singing together at the same time. Or they sang as part of pairs and groups in some other sort of context. So if any of those descriptions were found in the write-up of the species, then the females were scored as having song. Or the females were described as having song absent, which is when the account described the song as occurring only in males, or described as, in the description, the males were described as singing, but females were described as calling. So obviously calling is quite different from singing because it tends to be used across the whole year for a variety of functions, whereas singing tends to be used only during the breeding season and for kind of breeding specific type functions for the most part. The third category was no species-specific song, and this is when all vocalizations for a species were described as calls and were either kind of broadband or simple, which are kind of quantifiable ways to indicate that something is not a song, but rather is a call instead. Or they also used this classification when the description specifically said that no song was present. So there are lots of species in which there isn't any song whatsoever, and so they were able to use kind of these two criteria to recognize those. And then the final category was unknown, And this included when there was no information on which sex produces songs. So maybe it said that song was present in the bird, but it didn't specify which type of bird was singing. Or it was unclear whether song was produced within the species at all. So they just couldn't use those sources to gather the data. So because of these lacking data, they could only create scores for 323 out of those 1,100 and some species. So obviously that is going to reduce the data set by quite a lot. And that really emphasizes how we still have so much more scientific research to do about a lot of the species that are out there in the world. So we have huge levels of biodiversity, and of course we can't go out and study every single species. And this is actually something that you really notice if you ever go to the website of the IUCN and you look at all the species that have been listed as endangered or least endangered or whatever classification. There are tons and tons and tons where it says not enough data are available to give a classification. So we don't really know if these animals are out there. We don't know exactly where it is they're living. We don't know how they behave. There are all sorts of things that are missing. And it is really stunning when you think about, the fact that you could probably name 100 different animals, and yet there are so many more out there that we know absolutely nothing about. And it really drives home, whenever you try to do a study like this, that has this kind of evolutionary bent, and so you want to get as much data as possible on as many related species as possible so that you can really reconstruct that family tree, and suddenly it becomes very noticeable when you do have these gaps where we just don't know about the species, which actually should be quite exciting to you if you're someone who wants to go out and do research. Maybe you're a student, you're a budding scientist, that there are actually lots of species out there still that remain undiscovered or very much unknown. So there's still a lot that can be done. So even though it's kind of a loss in a way, it's also very much an opportunity. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, sorry. That's just a little bit of the science nerd in me coming out. So as I said, they've got this 323 core species, and then they kind of reduce that a little bit more in doing the phylogenetic trees. So they used the passerine tree data that were created by that second study, the one that's in 2012, and that's because that one is the most up-to-date study. And what those guys did was they went to an online resource called GenBank. And GenBank is a place where people who take samples from species, it doesn't have to be birds, it can be anything really, they can deposit the sequences of the DNA. So people will sequence all different portions of DNA for various types of studies that they do. And when they have finished doing that, they upload into the database so that anyone else can access that. And you don't have to do that, but a lot of financial places, when they give you money, when you have a grant that's funded, or whenever you publish a paper, they do say that you have to do that in order to get that paper published, in order to get that grant funding. Because when they encourage people to share these data, it actually makes future analyses much easier. So you can then go figure out what things are related, what things share the same gene, what types of mutation do you see on different genes, on the same gene in different animals, and so on and so on. And studies like this are made possible by the fact that people will have put all these different sequences up for lots of different species. And in fact, they were able to get about 67% of all passerine species in this analysis that these guys did a couple years ago. And that was every single species that was possible at the time of the study. So they downloaded everything from GenBank when they did this. And the tree contained calibrated branch lengths that were based on molecular divergence. So basically, the more closely related things were, the smaller the branches were, the farther apart they were, the longer the branches. So this is, you're able to quantify here how close something is and how distant it is, not just in time, but also in relationship and how diverged these things are from each other. And this is a really important thing to be able to do in doing the next analysis, which is the maximum likelihood reconstruction. And don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with the results of this analysis, mostly because I don't entirely understand how it works myself. But the idea is that they're basically using these analytical processes to figure out the most likely scenario, the most likely ancestral state of these birds, given all those different characteristics that they see in the birds that descended from them. And as I said, the more you see a characteristic popping up again and again and again as you go back in time and find all of those kind of things close to the ancestor, the more likely it is that the ancestor had that trait as well. And so they want to see those branch lengths, those distances between the ancestor and the current bird, because that is how they can then figure out the ones that should have that trait if that trait likely came from the ancestor. So the most comprehensive tree that they were able to create for the species in the current study contained 281 of the 323 species for which they had any song information. So this is the final bit of kind of culling from the overall sample. So they're able to have, out of that original sample size of 1,100 and some, 281 that they could actually test in their analysis. And the non-included species, so the ones that they had to get rid of, these were spread across 17 of 32 families, of which 90% had female songs. And so actually what this means is that having to exclude those species probably doesn't bias their analysis and actually makes their results a conservative estimate. So we can probably rely on these because if anything, if those birds had been included, it would have made the findings that they made even stronger and even more likely. Now, in order to ensure that the results weren't influenced by the fact that they were only using this one single family tree from that one single paper, they repeated their analyses with 100 randomly sampled trees from an additional avian phylogenetic study. So they took all these different bits of genetic research that had been done elsewhere, and they re-ran all of their analyses using those family trees in addition to that main family tree from the 2012 study. And the main difference is that there were 80 species included in the most recent paper that hadn't been in those other trees, and that's why this current one was the best. But they were able to use all those little fragments from the previous ones, those bits and pieces that were excluding those 80 species, and rerun just to double check that their results were pretty solid. And in fact, they did find that there was a great similarity of results regardless of the tree. So no matter how you cut it, their results are pretty good and pretty convincing. And I will leave you hanging there and give you one more song to have a bit of a rest and come back and think about what the results were and why it's also interesting. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was the Lone Bellow with Tree to Grow. And just before the break, I was talking about the methods that were used in a recent study to figure out whether female song is a bit more common in birds than we previously thought, and whether in fact it is the ancestral state of birds. And I left you hanging, wondering what the results were, so now I will satisfy your curiosity. So as I mentioned before, they surveyed 1,100 songbird species and ultimately were able to score 323 of those for presence or absence of female song. And what they found was that female song was present in 71%, or the majority, of songbird species. So that's 229 of the 323. And this is this is 32 out of the 34 Aucine families that they surveyed. So obviously female song is a lot more common than you might think if you were just looking around at birds here in the UK or here in the US, which is where these things tend to be studied the most. And the result complements actually a regional study that recently was done that found that female song is present in 43% of European passerine species. So actually much more common than we tend to think, but these are often birds that aren't right here in the UK, and they're off maybe in the countryside in undisturbed places, so they're not the sorts of species that we encounter a lot. And this is going to include probably lots of things in the more tropical bits of Europe, so kind of in the Mediterranean type area really, where we don't encounter those birds quite as much, and they're maybe kind of hiding out in little wild patches. So basically both that regional study and this global study are suggesting that female song is much more widespread than we tend to think. Now they also did an ancestral state reconstruction to try to figure out how common is this characteristic in the early origins of birds. And they mapped data from the female song survey onto recent and very exhaustive phylogenetic family tree for passerines that was constructed from lots of different sequences available online. And they used a couple of different analyses. One is called parsimony analysis, which is just kind of, the easiest explanation probably is the correct one, and also something called maximum likelihood analysis. and that one kind of explains itself given how it's phrased. And they used both of these different types of things to reconstruct the ancestral state using kind of what we see today. So the first analysis, the parsimony analysis, provided a result that suggested that there was a 100% likelihood of female song in the ancestral state. And the maximum likelihood one was very close to that, suggesting that there was a 92% likelihood of female song. Now, as I said, they also performed additional reconstructions using a sample of 100 other molecular trees from different papers, not just that main 2012 paper, and they found very similar results. So 100% for the parsimony analysis and 93% for the maximum likelihood. So cumulatively, these results are suggesting it's very likely that the ancestor of all songbirds had a female in the species that sang as much as the male, or sang maybe in a similar way to the male. Now, they performed some kind of analyses to look at how robust their results were to missing data. So basically this is suggesting that perhaps the types of data that they had and the types of analyses that they did kind of predisposed a certain type of result because of kind of artifacts of how these things run. And what you can do is exclude bits of your data and rerun the analyses in order to figure out whether you would still get the same result if there were kind of a difference in how you sampled, if you hadn't preloaded with a certain type of species. And in fact, they did find that when they did lots of different reanalyses where they just randomly excluded different bits of the family tree, they got pretty much the same results. So again, 93%, 85%. So it dips a little bit, but still the results are very much suggesting that female song was present in the ancestral state. And again, they conducted sensitivity analysis, which is another way of looking to see whether little variations in how you went about collecting the data and classifying things and running the analyses could impact your results. And so they randomly went in and changed some of the values from female song present to female song absent to see whether, maybe they misclassified things, or maybe they interpreted data incorrectly, maybe there were some missing data, and maybe this influenced their results. But when they changed everything around, they still found, again, very high probability, something like 87% of ancestral female song. And again, that's quite conservative because we know that female song is actually present in at least 1/3 of all the species that have available data. And so we already know that female song is incredibly common, and so when they made their when they made their analyses run assuming an even lower incidence of what's actually known and still got that very high likelihood, that really solidifies the likelihood and really convinces them and makes them feel quite secure in saying that the ancestral state most likely is what their result was suggesting, which is that females were singing. So you might think that maybe this is a bit of a kind of an academic exercise, it's a bit esoteric, but it is quite an exciting result because we all tend to say when we talk about birds and hear them in the spring that it's the males that are singing and they're singing for the females. But really this suggests that we need to reevaluate our current view. And maybe male trait, the male trait isn't the only one. Maybe it's not a male trait versus a female trait. It's just a trait that all birds have, and we just happen to live with some birds that have lost this particular trait. And it's a characteristic that's much more widespread, and it's potentially a characteristic that's not been pressured through sexual selection to evolve in the way it has. It could have been something else that was driving this process. And we do know that females as well as males can experience really intense competition over ecological resources. And this can select for traits that signal their competitive prowess or their ownership of resources. So just as males, we know now, can use song to look attractive to females and to scare off males, females could do this as well. And we know that they do this in some tropical habitats. So now we get the idea that probably there were lots and lots of birds over time that have used song in this very same way. So they're just like males trying to get out there and get the resources from the habitat and survive and show off and basically get involved in conflicts with other animals the very same way that males do. And the current sexual dimorphism that we see in song in some species may actually reflect evolutionary losses of female song from an ancestor in which both sexes were singing. And this perhaps means that there has been some selection against traits in females. And this parallels recent findings on the evolution of plumage morphology in birds as well. So it seems that sometimes there were females that were quite bright in the past, and then over evolutionary time they lost that brightness, and now we have these kind of duller or more subtle females. And the same thing might have happened not just in visual signals, but also in acoustic signals. And this is quite an interesting question that this raises. Why is it that females have lost song secondarily in some lineages? And this is something that people will need to go out and research. Now we have identified 4 main correlates of female song. So these guys have looked, and when I say we, what I really mean is they, they've looked across all these different birds that they've surveyed, and they found that female song is most common in areas that are tropical, where there's year-round territoriality, where there are convergent sex roles, so both the male and the female are doing the same sorts of things to maintain the territory, to fight off intruders, to raise the young, etc. And also when there is sexual dichromatism in carotenoid-based colors. So when you've got males and females looking different, and the differences have to do with pigments that are found out in nature, the carotenoids, and they get those in their food. So this is all kind of some interesting stuff where they can begin to put these things together to think about what the ancestral environment might have been like, and what evolutionary pressures might have come up over the years to start to drive some birds to keep those traits and other birds to get rid of those traits. Now, the sex differences and the developmental neuroanatomy of songbirds they're actually really consistent with an early origin of birdsong in both sexes. So male and female songbirds develop equivalent neural song production systems during their embryonic development. If you look at the brains of these animals, both males and females are capable of learning song. They can produce song, so if you actually inject females with hormones, you can get them acting very much like the males. You know, the brains are set up to do it, the body is set up to do it. It just happens to be that females don't have the hormonal fluctuations that inspire that behavior in them. But clearly in some of these tropical species, and species with those other characteristics, this is something that happens. So physically, they are set up, and that suggests that, you know, maybe that happens because back in the day, in an ancestor, they needed that equipment more, and it just happens that now some of them no longer use it. So in other words, the sexual dimorphism in the song control system of some songbirds, like the sexual dimorphism in the song production itself, is consistent with that secondary loss of those attributes in the females of some song species. So it's not been gained in the females that are producing song, but it's been lost in the ones that don't. So females would likely make a good model for comparative studies that investigate candidate genes and molecular pathways that regulate song control and vocal learning, because we know that they have all these characteristics, they're just not always using them. So this might help us figure out why there are some communication deficiencies in some birds or even in some humans, because there are lots of parallels. So you might be able to study them to figure out why is it that you do have some organisms that are capable of doing this behavior and others that aren't capable, even though they're wired in exactly the same way. So not only has this opened up kind of a bit of an evolutionary examination, it also is one that could potentially be quite applied in medical and developmental, and actually useful to humans as well. So basically the bottom line is, according to these authors, that female song shouldn't be considered an evolutionary oddity. In fact, it's actually the norm, and it's just something that's been lost over time. So now we need to identify the mechanisms that mediate the diversity and plasticity that we observe in modern-day songbird brain and behavior, and we also need to determine the selection pressures that are driving the maintenance, the elaboration, and in some species, the loss of female song.